Welcome back in. We're on to our week 15 must play defenses of the week, as well as some streaming options for you. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to start off with our top defenses of the week. And we're going to start with the Ravens going up against the Giants this week. The Ravens return from their week 14 bye again with a juicy matchup against the Giants. Despite only generating pressure on 21% of dropback, which ranks 17th in the league, they have the third most sacks and the 11th most pressures on the season. As we all know, the Ravens secondary has been a problem this year. However, we have seen a bit of a shift the last month or so. They've allowed the 15th most passing yards per game, the 17th most passing touchdowns, and the third lowest completion percentage since week 9. As for the Giants, their offense has been absolutely anemic. Their offensive line has been a mess, allowing 3.2 sacks per game and over 4 sacks per game over their last 3 games. In Drew Lock's last 3 starts, he has averaged 138 passing yards and completed just 52% of his passes with 0 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. The Ravens are 14.5 point favorites in this one, and the Ravens defense is easily the number one defense on the week. Next up is the Jets against the Jags. Jets defense on the surface hasn't been what we thought, as they have been the DST 19 on the season. However, when this team could completely given up, they started to play a little bit better defensively. Since week 11, the Jets are actually the DST 9 and scoring 7 fantasy points per game. Next up is a matchup against the Jags, who have done a decent job limiting sacks, but this is certainly not an offense that scares you, making the Jets a pretty safe play this week. And then lastly, we have the Vikings. Once again, surprise, surprise. You don't really need me to tell you how dominant this defense has been this year. So let's head straight to the matchup. The Bears have allowed 4.3 sacks per game, the highest rate in the league, and over 5 sacks per game over the last 3. Expect the Vikings defense to feast on Caleb Williams, who has yielded the 7th most fantasy points as a defense this season. So those are my top 3 plays on the defensive side of the ball. Let's move over to our streaming options for the week, and we're going to start with Washington Commanders. The Commanders defense ranks top 10 in pressure rate this season and top 12 in sacks. They really haven't been great in terms of causing turnovers, as they have only caused a turnover on 9.2% of offensive drives. But the good news is for the Commanders, they face the Saints offense without Derek Carr this week. It didn't really matter if it's Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler. Neither figured to be much of an issue for the Commanders defense this week, especially when you consider how few weapons remain on this defense. The Commanders are easily a top streaming option of the week. Next up is the Arizona Cardinals. Even though last week was not a great result, the Cardinals have a top 12 defense since week 9 and are averaging nearly 5 sacks per game. With Drake May coming to town, we should expect plenty of opportunities for the Cardinals defense to rack up fantasy points. May has been sacked 3 or more times in 4 of his last 5 games, has turned the ball over in 5 straight games, and has allowed the 6th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. So the Cardinals are a top 10 defense for me this week. Next up is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals, and I'm not going to lie, it feels a little bit gross, but the Bengals defense has been terrible this year. They're averaging just 4 fantasy points per game. Only the Falcons have fewer sacks, and they rank 21st in turnovers created. So why do we want to play the Bengals? Will Levis is the answer to that. Will Levis has been pretty awful this year. He has more turnovers than touchdowns and gets sacked at the 3rd highest rate in the league. Everything considered, since he is still one of the better defenses this week, with the Titans running the most fantasy points to opposing defenses this season, allowing 11.2 per game. So I don't mind firing up the Cincinnati Bengals defense. Lastly, let's hit on the Cowboys. Since week 10, the Cowboys have been the number 2 overall scoring defense in fantasy, scoring 12.3 fantasy points per game. They are tied with the Broncos with 16 sacks, and they also trail only the Texans and Vikings in interceptions, and also have the 5th most forced fumbles as well. While the Panthers' offense has certainly improved, they still allow the 14th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. And I do think Cowboys should be considered a top 15 defense this week. So that pretty much wraps it up. Let us know in the comments section below if you have any questions, any other defenses that you may have questions about that we didn't get to. We'll see you on the next one. Good luck this week in the fantasy playoffs. Let's get that dub. Only a few more weeks away from the fantasy championship. Let's get it.